Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast that explores nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, well, I wanted to welcome you back to the next episode, episode 4 of Getting Started in Wildlife Photography. If you've been following this podcast, you'll know that I am producing a series of podcasts related to getting started in wildlife photography. This will be the final podcast in that series, and today I'm going to discuss 2 additional pieces of gear which I think are essential for wildlife photography: the tripod and the flash. Now, before we get into what brands and types of tripods to buy, I want to talk about why you actually need a tripod. And the first and most important area that a tripod gives you is stability. And I can't emphasize that enough. That's really what a tripod's all about. It's stability, stability, stability. So right off the bat, let's talk about when you would use a tripod versus, when you would actually just hand hold your camera. Well, there's a couple things you need to think about. Tripods give you a way to stabilize your camera during a time when your shutter speed is low. So primarily I'm going to use a tripod when my shutter speed is too low to hand hold. So how do I know, when that point is? Well, it's different for each lens that you have and possibly even camera, depending on camera body stabilization versus lens stabilization. But generally speaking, without any kind of lens stabilizing systems, optical stabilization, let's use a for example. Let's say I'm shooting with a 300 millimeter lens and I have a meter reading of f5.6 at 1/100th of a second. So basically, if you take your lens's greatest focal length, which in this case is 300 millimeters, I don't want to shoot a shutter speed that is greater than that focal length. So if it's 300, I want to be somewhere around 1/320th of a second or 1/500th of a second in order to hand hold that lens. Now, with modern optical stabilization, that does change the mix, but for now, just use that formula. So for example, if I was shooting at 1/500th of a second, then my lens should be less than a 500 millimeter. So I hope that kind of helps you with that rule of thumb. But there's other reasons to use a tripod. Another reason to use a tripod is simply to give you hands free. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, when I'm photographing landscapes, for example, it's nice sometimes to have your camera locked down, locked into a composition. I'm making very subtle tweaks to the panning or the tilting or the height of the tripod. I'm trying to get exactly where I want to be in that moment. So that's a perfect example of times that I would want a tripod even though my shutter speed might be high enough. Now, the last reason that you want to use a tripod is for visual effects. So let's say I'm taking a picture of a waterfall, for example. And in order to get the cotton candy blurry waterfall, I need to be shooting it down to a second or two, sometimes even longer depending on the flow of water, sometimes a little less. And so in that case, I cannot hand hold that without just having a big blur of a photograph. So that's a situation where I'm going to use a tripod. Those scenarios are the things that you're going to run into. Now, as a wildlife photographer, we're trying to keep our shutter speeds high generally anyway, because the animal's moving. And so generally, you're going to be shooting at a high enough shutter speed where you can shoot handheld. But there are those circumstances, for example, where you're in early morning light and maybe you're just taking portraits and the animal's pretty still. That's a great place for a tripod. Let's kind of transition from why to use a tripod or when to use a tripod to cheap versus expensive. How much money are we looking at here? and the prices vary from $50 to hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And I am definitely going to tell you that you get what you pay for with tripods generally. If you buy a cheap department store quality tripod, you're going to have extremely, I don't want to say you're going to have bad pictures. You could have bad pictures, but you're going to have a very difficult time because they're not made to handle the weight of a DSLR. A lot of times they're not made to handle the weight of long lenses, and so you get drift where you kind of walk away from your camera, and the next thing you know, even though your tripod's perfectly locked down, you come back and your camera's tilted all the way down. Things like that. You get more vibration in the legs with a cheaper tripod, and that's going to translate into your picture. You're going to have more vibration that can be seen through blur in your photograph. And so I am not a fan of cheap tripods. That said, you don't have to buy the best tripod on the market. Again, there are companies that produce great tripods for a fraction of the cost of some of the more expensive brands. There's a myriad of tripods on the market, more now than I think I've ever seen. Some of the more accepted brands are Manfrotto, Really Right Stuff, also known as Really Expensive Stuff, Enduro, and Gitzo. There's many other brands out there, but these are the ones I would stick with when you're buying a tripod. So let's get into the construction of tripods, because they're primarily two types of tripods. There's a third type, but you don't see those very often. There's aluminum, there's carbon fiber, and in the old days, you may even find one of these still around, there's wooden tripods. We're going to talk about just the aluminum and the carbon fiber tripods. First of all, what are the pros and cons of aluminum? Aluminum is, first of all, less expensive. It's, in my opinion, more durable. I've had an aluminum Manfrotto Bogan tripod since 1995. I still use it every time I go out. That says a lot about Manfrotto. What are some of the cons of aluminum? Well, they're loud. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're walking down a trail and you're trying not to scare wildlife, aluminum makes noise. It clinks. As you walk through, it'll bang on belt buckles, it'll bang on anything hanging off your backpack, and so on. So I do have that caveat with them. They also get very cold in the wintertime. So if you're out there in 20-degree weather without gloves on and you're trying to hold on to your tripod, your hands are going to freeze. That simple. The cold will go right through a light pair of gloves also. Another con, aluminum tripods are heavier. Because they're not made of lightweight carbon fiber, they tend to be a little heavier. And because of that, if you're getting up there in age, or you've got back problems, joint problems, shoulder problems, you may want to steer away from a carbon fiber tripod. But I'll tell you, I've had an aluminum. I believe in aluminum tripods. I think they're awesome. Don't think you have to buy a carbon fiber just because that's the newer construction. I just don't believe that. Don't buy something because it's newer. Buy something because it works. So what are the pros of the carbon fiber? They're durable. Maybe not quite as durable as aluminum. That's arguable. They are less cold in the wintertime. You can pick up one of these very easily, and the cold doesn't translate through your hands as bad. They're lighter. That's probably the biggest advantage. They are absolutely a lot lighter. And so again, if you've got a bad back, bad joint, so on, arthritis, definitely go for the carbon fiber. This is arguable, but they are supposed to be less apt to transfer vibrations. For example, in the case of, let's say you're set up on a windy day, normally wind really influences your tripod, and so it can cause vibrations, and it kind of acts like a little miniature sail, and it can move and cause vibrations in your photographs. So that's that's important. I mean, have I had a lot of difficulty with aluminum tripods in the wind? Not really. A little bit. I think it's overstated to some degree, but it does have an influence. What's the cons of a carbon fiber? Much more expensive, and they do break at the joints easier than aluminum tripods do. And I've heard this over and over again from people. But I think they're getting better, and so that may not be as true anymore as it used to be. So there's two parts to the tripod, right? There's the legs of the tripod, which is also called the sticks. It's the bottom part of the tripod. It's the what we think of when we think of a tripod. The second part of the tripod is the head. Now the head is important because this is the piece that your camera sits on. This is the piece that you pan or tilt or move so that you can frame up your image. So it becomes very important. There's primarily three types of heads. There's a pan tilt, there's a ball head, and there's a gimbal head. Now the pan tilt head, I think, is a great all-around head. It doesn't get near enough credit in the photo world. A lot of people don't like them. I love mine. It's easy to use. I can do video on it. I can do panning of birds in flight. It's basically a poor man's gimbal head. We'll talk about the gimbal head here in a minute. In my mind, it's the best bang for your buck if you're on a budget. Next, there's a ball head. Ball heads are a little less intrusive on you. They don't have handles sticking out of them that you use to control pan and tilt, and so they're a little smaller. They're not good for video. They're not good for panning with birds in flight and so on. They're generally best used in situations where you're photographing a landscape, for instance. Something you're not going to have to move around a lot. So I do recommend ball heads. I own one, but again, if you can only afford one head, go for the pan tilt. Okay, so now what about the kinds of tripods out there? What tripod legs are out there? What heads are out there? I mean, what I'm saying is what manufacturers are out there and which do I recommend? Let's talk first about my favorite on the used market. Now, I'm a big proponent of buying things used when possible. And there's one tripod that's been around for many years. It's known to be stable. It's built rugged. And that's the Manfrotto Bogen 3021 or the 3221. The difference is the 3221 is the black version. It's an old tripod. It can be purchased used on eBay for about $100 US. Personally, I prefer to own the Bogen 3221. The 3221 is one great tripod. It's made of aluminum. It's not fancy carbon fiber, so that may be a deal breaker for you. I've combined mine with a Bogen 3030 pan tilt head, which gives me an ultra stable platform. I bought this rig in 1995. It's still going strong today. I've had it at the beach. I've had it anchored in a stream up to the tripod head. About every other imaginable environment that Eastern America can hand out, I've had it there. It's solid, and I mean solid. If you purchase a 3030 head, you have a head which can be used for video or a poor man's gimbal head because it's a pan tilt head. So that allows me more to easily pan with birds, make quick adjustments, and so on. This head will run you somewhere between $30 and $60. So your total investment on the used market for the Bogen 3221 is $150. Okay, that's cheap because if you were to buy a Gitzo, you're going to be up closer to $1,000 for a very similar model. And so I'm a big fan of Manfrotto. Okay, so what's my favorite on the new market? That's a tough question because I am not on the market for one. I have actually done a little research on it to see which one I would choose if this actually is needed. But right now I'm still using that old Manfrotto 3221. But if I had to buy one, I would stick with Manfrotto. And I'd probably buy, there's one called the MT055 X Pro 3. It's an aluminum tripod. It supports 17.6 pounds. It's 60 inches high without the center column. It's aluminum construction. It's going to run somewhere around $360 with the head. So it's going to be twice as much as the used version of this. So that's something to think about. And again, I match this up with the Manfrotto 3-way pan tilt head that's available for it. So that's pretty much it when it comes to tripods. Tripods are really boring to talk about. They don't really do anything except support your equipment, but that support is so critical that I feel like I probably did it a little injustice here. I mean, I can't emphasize it enough. Get a good tripod. Do not buy a Walmart tripod. Trust me. I've been there. I bought them, and they're terrible. But that's pretty much it on the whole tripod thing. I don't really know how to go into more detail on it, except to say that there is another option too that you want to consider in wildlife photography, and that is the gimbal head. Now, the gimbal head allows you to pan with your subject very easily. It's designed for large lenses, and what you do is you attach your lens to it and your camera body, but your lens mainly goes in there, and it kind of cradles your camera and lens in a way that's balanced. So that massive camera and lens combination are no longer heavy per se, and you can easily swing it. You can pan and tilt. Highly recommend one of these. I don't use it yet, but I am going to buy one of these probably in the next 2 years. I do a lot of handheld bird photography, so I don't use a tripod nearly as much as some people do. But if you've got a big lens at 600 millimeters or better, you really need to be looking at a gimbal head down the road. The other thing I want to mention is not tripod related at all, but it is support related, and that's a bean bag. I have bought one of the Grizzly bean bags, and I use this when I'm in my car, using my car as a blind. And what it does is it's basically a saddle that goes over your door when your window is rolled down, and it's filled with beans, and it just allows a stable platform to rest your camera on while you're shooting. And I highly recommend this. I'll put links in the show notes for it as well, but definitely worth checking out. Okay, so that's about it for tripods. Let's talk about flashes. First, I want to say that whenever possible, I prefer not to shoot wildlife with a flash. The external flash is a pain to lug around, it's a pain to set up, and it's limiting in its light casting ability. There are, however, times when the flash makes great sense, and it will actually add to the photograph when you're shooting a subject. Okay, so first of all, one scenario where you really need to use a flash is deep shade. Have you ever tried to photograph a subject in deep shade, and perhaps you're in a forest or you're in a house? The effect is roughly the same. The deep and dark shadows tend to give us less detail and color, and frankly turn them into dark mush. In this situation, the external flash is really a must. I find myself mostly shooting in a situation when photographing perched birds in the woods. For example, let's say it's about 6:30 or 7 in the morning, maybe it's even close to 8, but you're in the edge of a woods and you have a great horned owl perched on a branch there. It's dark, it's deep shade, and I don't care how good of a system you have, you do not have a system good enough to photograph that owl well in that low light. And here's why I say it. Even if you could get a well-lit, I don't want to use the word well-lit, that's wrong. Even if you have a situation where you can get enough gain to get a properly exposed photograph, the owl is more than likely going to have too much shade. He's going to have, his eyes are going to be dark. He's going to look kind of lifeless. And this is where a flash comes in. That flash, it pops. All that detail and texture pops when you hit him with a flash. So deep shade, absolute must. You've got to learn to use a flash. I do want to say that in this situation, the results are not always pleasing. And let's be honest, it doesn't look natural to fire a flash that bright. And it does illuminate everything, but it casts odd shadows, it's flat, and I don't like to do this. I will do this if I have to. And so that's why I recommend that if you're in a situation, it's better to photograph the owl with full flash than go home with no photograph. So again, not an ideal situation. Deep shade is generally discouraged. It's just not a great looking, flattering image. But if you got to do it, go with the flash. The other type of shade that you're going to find is a more common type, and that's open shade. I think of it as the less annoying and sometimes pleasurable cousin to deep shade. Open shade is found near buildings, under trees. It doesn't have the extremely dark characteristics of deep shade, but does render your images with a blue cast if not compensated for. In this situation, you use your flash to fill in the subject rather than lighting the subject completely. So let's stop there. That's an important concept. In deep shade, you're using your flash to completely illuminate the subject. In a fill flash scenario, you are getting an ambient exposure of your bird or animal, and then you're popping just enough flash in there to just give a little sparkle to the eye and maybe light up the feathers a little bit. You don't want it to look unnatural. So fill flash is a great way in open shade to open up a little bit of those shadows and just give it a kiss of light. So that's the second scenario that I would use it in. So I guess now is a good time to talk about something else which comes up frequently. Does flash scare birds? Does it scare birds? Does it scare animals of any kind? Flash produces a very brief burst of light that is closely related to a natural phenomenon that we're all familiar with, lightning, right? Birds live with lightning all the time, and they get used to it. For the most part, birds are not afraid of a flash. I have noticed, however, that intense light may give them a slight pause, but the shutter on the camera and you moving is far more likely to scare the bird than the flash. Now, having said that, I have seen birds fly away just from a burst of light from the flash. It does happen. But they'll come right back. They're not going to stay away for very long. If you've got a food source, they're coming back. So I wanted to get that out of the way right away. Okay, on to the equipment side. What flashes do I recommend? There's generally two types of flashes out there. There's what's called ETTL, which is a through-the-lens flash system, which basically, I'm not going to go into the details on how it works, but basically, your flash is controlled via your camera, so it can see through your lens, basically, so that it knows exactly when to fire the flash and then stop the flash to give you the right exposure. It's all automatic. If you want to override it, you have to use exposure compensation. It's a great system. I don't use it. Okay, I'll be just honest with you. I do not use ETTL. I am a manual flash guy. I always have been. So with that, I'm going to recommend two possible options. The first manual flash is an old tried and true flash. You can only get it on the used market, and that's the Vivitar 285. This flash will do everything you need, including shooting high-speed bursts. It has a zoom head to extend its range or to light up a wide-angle view. I used one of these when I was in college. It's great. You can pick it up on the used market for $100. If you're budget-minded, and I mean really budget-minded, there's a Chinese company that puts out a flash. It's called a Newer. It's not just a Newer. It's released under various manufacturers, but it's called a TT520. It's completely manual, no frills, and it's going to cost you about $30 or $40. That's it. I'm not kidding you. I have two of these flashes that I use for hummingbirds, and they get the job done. They're not perfect. I don't really recommend that you run out and get these unless you really are on a budget. But they will teach you how to use a manual flash. And so why am I big on manual flashes? Well, manual flashes teach you how to use a flash. They teach you the difference in power and the ratio of power to flash output. They teach you how to dial in perfectly that manual exposure. Can you do that with ETTL? ETTL? Yes, absolutely. You can do everything with ETTL. You're just going to spend more money. Do I recommend ETTL? I don't have a problem with it, but you can do everything you need to with a manual flash, and you can save yourself a lot of money. There are other flashes that are manual that you can buy. There's just a ton. There's old Sunpack flashes. There's Metz flashes. There's other Vivitar flashes out there, but the price difference is astounding. I mean, you're talking about the difference between a TTL lens or flash, excuse me, will cost you $400 or $500, whereas a manual flash would cost you between $30 and $100. So huge difference. Again, I prefer to not even use a flash if at all possible. And again, I'm kind of giving you a cursory look at this stuff today. There's so much more information out there. I've got information on my website, and I'll give you links to that in the show notes. All I'm trying to do is give you a step forward to try to take that massive market out there of flashes and tripods and just condense it down into a few models that you can choose from, and you're not going to go wrong with them. And that's really what I'm trying to do here with all 4 of these episodes. Is it's so difficult to know what to buy, and what ends up happening is you go out there and you buy something cheap, and it doesn't work for you, and then you try to buy something a little bit more expensive, and that kind of works for you, and then you finally buy something even more expensive, and that works for you. So what I'm trying to do is save you those first few steps and find something that's useful for you. Okay, welcome back. This is the Know Your Subject segment of the podcast. In this segment, we take one animal species and we discuss how that animal behaves and how you can use this information to make you a better wildlife photographer. I truly believe that in order to be a better wildlife photographer, we must know the subject and know what to expect from the wildlife. The sound you just heard was the warning call of the Osprey. And it's one you'll often hear as a photographer. Cornell's Lab of Ornithology defines the osprey as a very large, distinctively shaped hawk. And despite their size, their bodies are slender, with long, narrow wings and long legs. Ospreys fly with a marked kink in their wings, making an M shape when seen from below. Ospreys are brown above and white below, and overall they are whiter than most raptors. From below, the wings are mostly white with a prominent dark patch at the wrists. The head is white with a broad brown stripe through the eye. Juveniles have white spots on the back and a buffy shading on the breast. So that's the technical on the osprey. I have to say that ospreys are becoming one of my favorite birds to photograph. And thanks to massive conservation efforts, their numbers have never been better. They had a sharp decline in the 20th century due to the use of a pesticide called DDT. But once it was banned, both the eagles and the hawks, like the osprey, steadily increased in numbers. So where can you find ospreys? Simply put, you find them where the fish are. You find them near any body of water that can support a healthy fish population. So this can be lakes, rivers, oceans, creeks, ponds. I saw one in a small pond one day. Specifically, there's a lot of conservation efforts going on with ospreys even to this day, and so what you'll see in larger bodies of water are these man-made nest platforms, and in the springtime the ospreys will start building their nests there, and that's a great time to go photograph them. Now, be careful with that, because you don't want to photograph them and cause them to abandon their nests and so on. So get yourself a blind or get yourself some camo and a blind and hide yourself, and you can photograph them all day long. I thought I would just kind of explain to you a couple hints or tactics when photographing ospreys. Ospreys tend to have a pattern or a method to their madness. Let's say I arrive at about 7:30 in the morning. Sometime around 8 o'clock, I've noticed that they will take off and start hunting or fishing, whatever you want to call it. And they'll leave the nest platform. They'll go out and fish for anywhere from a half an hour to 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, and they'll come back. Sometimes with fish, sometimes not. And they'll just repeat that pattern. And as they come and go from their nests, they'll circle and they'll call to each other and so on. And it's a great time to photograph them. You can get shots of chicks in the nests, platforms. You can get shots of the parents feeding them, shots of the ospreys carrying fish, and so on. Awesome. And if you want to check out somebody that photographs osprey constantly, go check out a guy named Chris Rao. He's located up in Connecticut, and he specializes in osprey photographs, and he is just astounding at what he's done in a very short period of time. I'll put a link in the show notes on that. But that's pretty much it for this episode, and I apologize. It's a little choppy this time, and I apologize for that. I'm just coming off from Christmas, and it's just been a rough Christmas. The typical hustle and bustle, and so thanks for hanging in there with me. This is the last equipment podcast I'm going to do for a while. The next podcast is going to be my best of 2015 images, and this is a traditional thing I do where I take my top 10 images of 2015 and I go through them and I explain how I took the shot, where I took it, why I took it, and why I think it's my best shot. So it's kind of an exercise for all of us to go through. I actually encourage everyone to do that. And then beyond that, 2016 is going to have just a lot of great podcasts, a lot of great episodes, and I really look forward to it. I just wanted to leave you with this thought from L.L. Rue III. My reason for being is to make others aware through words and photographs of the beauty with which our Lord has surrounded us. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.